It was the sort of December morning that belonged on a postcard, crisp, white, and utterly deceiving. The snow lay thick over the countryside around Highmoor Hall, turning its broad lawns and ancient hedgerows into a landscape of frozen serenity. Inside, however, the atmosphere crackled with tension, for the grand estate was preparing for its first full family Christmas gathering in nearly a decade. Invitations had been sent with great enthusiasm. Replies, however, arrived laced with hesitation. Old quarrels, unresolved grievances, and simmering resentments all traveled quietly with the guests as they made their way to the country estate. Highmoor Hall, with its stone facade wrapped in evergreen garlands and its tall windows glowing gold against the winter gloom, should have been a place of festive harmony. Yet for those who knew the family history well, like the servants who exchanged worried whispers in the back corridors, the reunion felt less like a celebration and more like a storm gathering under a perfect sky. At the center of it all was Lady Eugenia Crawford, the formidable matriarch of the Crawford family. Even at 72, she radiated an unimpeachable authority that made grown men stand straighter and caused even the boldest of her children to mind their tongues at dinner. Her wealth, her influence, and her sharp intellect made her an unquestioned force. And it was precisely for those reasons that this Christmas was different. For Lady Eugenia had recently revised her will. Not a small adjustment, not a mere addition of a charity or a trinket. A complete restructuring, one that left nearly every member of her family either incandescent with hope or quietly seething with despair. No one knew the new terms. That was her pleasure. "Let them wonder," she had said to her butler, Simmons, with a thin, knowing smile. "And let them come home." Now, on the morning of December 23rd, the Crawfords and their extended circle of holiday guests were indeed arriving. Her eldest son, Victor, with his calculating eyes and carefully controlled charm. Her daughter, Isadora, whose delicate smile never quite reached her eyes. Her wayward nephew, Julian, freshly returned from the continent after a shadowy business scandal. And her longtime companion and secretary, Miss Margaret Dale, whose loyalty was unquestioned, but whose motives were perhaps not entirely pure. Among them were others, business associates, distant relatives, and one unexpected arrival who had not been on the original guest list. The most striking feature of Highmoor Hall's Christmas preparations was the wreath. Not just any wreath, but Lady Eugenia's prized solstice wreath, an antique creation dating back more than 2 centuries. It was a massive arrangement of preserved winter flowers, rare alpine herbs, and a centerpiece of scarlet holly shaped into a perfect ring. For generations, it had been hung above the great fireplace of the ballroom for one night only, Christmas Eve, symbolizing unity, prosperity, and the strength of family. To the Crawfords, however, it had come to mean something more ominous, the symbol of Lady Eugenia's power, a reminder that everything in their lives, from their allowances to their reputations, hung on her decisions. And perhaps, this year, the wreath also represented opportunity. That morning, while the hall buzzed with the rustle of servants, the scent of pine and cinnamon, and the faint hum of distant carols, a shriek shattered the fragile calm. It came from Emily Simmons, the butler's young daughter and one of the housemaids. She rushed into the foyer, pale and trembling, unable to speak at first. Lady Eugenia, who had been descending the grand staircase at the very moment, paused mid-step, her hand tightening on the polished banister. "What is it, child?" she demanded. Emily pointed toward the ballroom. Her lips moved, but her voice broke before any words came out. Lady Eugenia swept into the ballroom with the swiftness of someone half her age, and the moment she stepped inside, she stopped dead. Because the wreath was gone. The solstice wreath, the sacred heirloom, the irreplaceable Crawford symbol, had vanished from its place on the wall. The brass hook dangled empty, like an accusation. Pine needles littered the floor beneath it. A single crimson holly berry lay crushed on the polished parquet. "Who touched it?" Lady Eugenia whispered. The servants exchanged terrified glances. The wreath had been hung only the previous evening and locked behind the ballroom doors at night. Only a handful of people possessed keys. Lady Eugenia turned sharply to Simmons. "Find out who entered this room," she said, "immediately." But Simmons, who had served the family faithfully for nearly 30 years, already looked troubled. "My lady, that is the difficulty. The locks show no sign of tampering. The keys are accounted for, and the night watch reported nothing unusual." "Impossible," Lady Eugenia snapped. But even as she said the word, something colder than anger crept into her expression. Her eyes narrowed. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer, sharper. "Someone in this house," she said, "has taken it." The news spread like wildfire. Guests gathered in little clusters, voices lowered, eyes darting. Some feigned surprise, some appeared genuinely alarmed, and a few, only a few, looked almost pleased. A stolen wreath, however symbolic, would not normally have warranted outside intervention. But for Lady Eugenia Crawford, whose instincts were as fierce as her reputation, this was no mere prank. It was a challenge, a warning, a message, and she would not misinterpret it. By afternoon, the tension had grown unbearable. Victor Crawford insisted that the police be summoned at once. Isadora accused her brother of overreacting. Julian smirked knowingly, suggesting that perhaps the wreath had simply been misplaced. Miss Dale hovered at Lady Eugenia's side, speaking in clipped tones about inventories and security measures. Lady Eugenia listened to none of them. Instead, she made a single, decisive phone call to London, to a small, elegant apartment on Whitehaven Mansions, to the most famous and most exacting detective in Europe. When she returned to the drawing room, she announced simply, "Hercule Poirot will arrive tomorrow." The reactions were immediate and revealing. Victor stiffened. Isadora blanched. Julian raised his eyebrows with an expression that wavered between amusement and annoyance. Miss Dale's posture tightened slightly, as though bracing herself. "It is a wreath, mother," Victor said carefully. "Surely you do not intend to burden the great Monsieur Poirot with—" "This is no ordinary wreath," Lady Eugenia interrupted, "and this is no ordinary theft." Her eyes swept over her gathered family, lingering on each face as though memorizing their expressions. "Someone in this house has begun a game," she said softly, "but they have made one grave mistake." She turned toward the window, watching the snow fall in delicate spirals outside. "They believe I do not know who they are." A silence followed, deep, uneasy, electric. Lady Eugenia smiled faintly. "They are wrong." Snow continued to fall in delicate cascades over the countryside the following morning, blanketing Highmoor Hall beneath a pristine white veil. The stillness was broken only by the crunch of wheels against fresh snow as a dark, sleek motor car approached the grand estate. The driver slowed, guided up the long drive flanked by winter bare oaks, whose branches reached overhead like bony fingers. Inside, wrapped in a coat far too pristine for such a journey, and holding a walking stick that seemed chosen more for elegance than utility, sat Hercule Poirot. He observed the scenery with keen, assessing eyes. "Ah," he murmured softly to himself, "a house that wears its wealth like a well-tailored coat, and its secrets like a dagger beneath it." When the car came to a stop before the entrance, the front doors of Highmoor Hall opened wide. Simmons, the butler, stiff and formal, stepped out to greet the detective. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot." "At your service, monsieur." Simmons bowed his head respectfully, though his expression held something like unease. "Lady Eugenia is awaiting you. Please, come this way." Poirot stepped inside the great entrance hall, where evergreen garlands wrapped the balustrades and a massive crystal chandelier cast prisms of light across the marble floor. Decorative touches spoke of wealth, but also a precise, almost obsessive order. Everything arranged symmetrically, perfectly polished, immaculate. A house in which the smallest disruption would stand out. "How fitting," Poirot mused. He handed his coat and hat to a waiting footman and smoothed down his mustache with practiced care before joining. Simmons. As they walked toward the drawing room, Poirot's gaze flicked over every detail. The rugs, the portraits, the faint scuffs on the hallway floor, even the arrangement of the vases. To an ordinary visitor, they were decorations. To Poirot, they were data. Lady Eugenia Crawford rose from her armchair as Poirot entered the richly appointed drawing room. The fire crackled behind her, casting her silhouette sharply against the orange glow. Her posture was erect, regal even, and her eyes, dark, sharp, and unwavering, met Poirot's with formidable intelligence. "Monsieur Poirot, I thank you for coming." Poirot inclined his head deeply. "Madame, when one receives a summons from Lady Eugenia Crawford, one suspects it is not for a matter of trifles." Her expression softened just enough to reveal her approval. "You suspect correctly." She gestured for him to sit. The moment Poirot sank into the armchair, she spoke with the cool precision of someone long accustomed to command. "Something has been taken from me. Something that is not only valuable but significant. It was stolen yesterday morning, without force, without noise, and without any trace of intrusion." Poirot folded his hands neatly. "The solstice wreath." Lady Eugenia's eyes narrowed. "You already know?" "Your butler, Simmons, gave me the bare essentials as we walked, madame. But also," he tapped his temple, "the newspapers, they have long spoken of your Christmas traditions. The wreath is well known, a symbol of your family's legacy, n'est-ce pas?" "A symbol," she repeated, her voice cold. "Yes, and someone wished to strip me of it." "Or perhaps," Poirot said gently, "someone wished to send a message." Her gaze sharpened, but she did not deny it. He leaned forward. "Tell me, Lady Crawford, why invite your entire family here? I understand this is the first time in many years you have desired such a gathering." She studied him, calculating whether to answer. Then, with a sharp breath, "I revised my will." Poirot gave a small, thoughtful hum. "Motive," he murmured, "not for the theft of an object, but for the acquisition of certainty." Her brow arched. "You see already, Monsieur Poirot. I see only that emotions, they run high in matters of inheritance, and in such moments people behave, how shall I say, not wisely." Lady Eugenia's lips curled with faint amusement. "You'll find that my family seldom behaves wisely, even under calmer circumstances." Poirot rose. "Madame, before I interview your household, I wish to see the scene of the crime." Lady Eugenia nodded once. "Very well. Simmons will escort you to the ballroom." The doors creaked open to reveal a grand chamber with towering windows overlooking the snowy lawns. The Christmas tree, a towering fir decorated with red ribbons, golden baubles, and delicate porcelain ornaments, stood near the far wall, its lights dim in the morning gloom. But Poirot's attention moved instantly to the fireplace. Above it hung nothing. Only the empty brass hook remained, gleaming accusingly. He approached it at once, examining the wall, the floor, the mantelpiece. He knelt, inspecting the pine needles scattered in a half-moon pattern beneath the hook. Simmons shifted uneasily behind him. "The wreath was hung securely, monsieur. Heavy but stable. No draught or accidental tug could have dislodged it." Poirot nodded. "Indeed. But it is not how it fell that interests me. It is who wished it to vanish." He scanned the ballroom, taking in minute details. A slight disturbance in the dust beside the window, the faint odor of cloves and something more metallic. A missing ornament from the lower branches of the tree. A smudge on the parquet floor. Simmons cleared his throat. "Monsieur Poirot, the list of people who had access to this room." "Later," Poirot said quietly. First, I wish to see the emotions of this house. Simmons hesitated. The emotions, monsieur. Poirot smiled gently. But of course, a thief leaves behind more than footprints, mon ami. He leaves behind fear, or guilt, or satisfaction. Lady Eugenia summoned them to the drawing room for formal introductions. They arrived in pairs and clusters, each wearing expressions that attempted politeness but betrayed strain. Victor Crawford, tall, controlled, with a politician's smile and calculating eyes. Isadora, slight, elegant, wrapped in soft grey wool, her voice smooth and chilly. Julian, Lady Eugenia's nephew, lounging almost insolently, a man who cultivated charm as a shield. Miss Margaret Dale, the secretary, quiet and composed, hands clasped tightly behind her back. Several other guests hovered around the edges. Business associates, cousins, a retired colonel, a widowed friend of the family. Poirot observed all of them with the serene patience of a man taking inventory. Lady Eugenia cleared her throat. Monsieur Poirot will be conducting interviews. You will all make yourselves available. Julian chuckled softly. Over a wreath, Aunt Eugenia. Surely this is rather dramatic. Poirot's eyes flicked toward him. A wreath, monsieur? Or a warning? You seem certain the matter is trivial. Julian froze. Not visibly, but enough for Poirot to notice. A slight tightening around the jaw, a shift in posture. Isadora spoke next, her tone razor-thin. Mother, we all want to help, but this seems extreme. Poirot smiled pleasantly. Madame, the theft of an object is never merely the theft of an object. It is an act. It communicates. And if the solstice wreath has spoken, he gestured delicately, then it is my duty to understand its meaning. Silence settled. Tense. Heavy. Poirot clasped his hands. With your permission, Lady Crawford, I will begin the interviews this afternoon. Of course. He turned toward the family. But before then, he said mildly, yet with unmistakable sharpness, I advise you all to reflect carefully. The truth, she has a habit of revealing herself, even when someone wishes very much to hide it. A chill passed through the room, not from the winter outside, but from the realization that Hercule Poirot was already watching all of them. Poirot preferred to conduct interviews in a room that reflected order, calm, and neutrality. Highmoor Hall, however, offered no such sanctuary. Every room seemed soaked in history, portraits staring, carpets absorbing secrets, corners whispering of old gossip. So he chose the morning room, a sunlit chamber overlooking the south lawn. Even in winter, its windows caught what little daylight existed, softening the space with a fragile warmth. A writing desk stood near the window, a velvet settee along the wall, and two wing-back chairs opposite the fireplace. Poirot positioned the chairs carefully. One for himself, one for the interviewee. The distance between them, precise. The angle, deliberate. And at last, when the room matched his standards of symmetry and psychological balance, he asked Simmons to bring the first suspect. Victor entered with a confidence that bordered on theatrical. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and measured stride suggested a man used to commanding rooms. But Poirot knew better. People who oversold composure often had the most to hide. Monsieur Crawford, Poirot said, rising only half an inch before settling back into his chair. Please be seated. Victor sat stiffly. I must say, Monsieur Poirot, this whole affair is rather embarrassing for the family. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Embarrassment is a burden that many families must occasionally endure. But it is not embarrassment that interests me. It is truth. Victor exhaled slowly, a practiced, almost political gesture. Very well. What do you wish to know? Poirot folded his hands over his knee. Your relationship with Lady Eugenia. How would you describe it? A flicker, barely. A tension around the mouth. My mother and I have differing views. but we respect one another. Poirot smiled gently. Respect? Yes. And affection? Of course, Victor said too quickly. Poirot tilted his head. You are aware that Lady Eugenia has recently revised her will? Victor's stillness betrayed him more than any word. I heard rumors. Mother said nothing. Rumors, Poirot repeated softly. And how did such rumors reach your ears? Victor hesitated. Family whispers. One cannot stop people from speculating. Poirot studied him a moment longer. And on the morning the wreath disappeared, where were you? In my room. Reading. Alone? Yes. Can anyone confirm this? Victor's jaw tightened. No. Poirot offered a polite nod. Merci, monsieur. Victor rose before being dismissed. Another subtle sign of a man accustomed to power and unaccustomed to scrutiny. Isidora entered like a figure carved from winter itself. Her pale grey dress, her cool demeanor, her hands clasped delicately, as if any sudden motion might crack her. Madame, Poirot said warmly, you grace us. Isidora sat with feather-light grace. I would prefer to be anywhere else, Monsieur Poirot. A sentiment shared by many of those who find themselves in proximity to a crime, Poirot replied. Her eyes narrowed. A stolen wreath is hardly a crime of passion. Poirot leaned forward slightly, yet passion, of some sort, must be involved. The solstice wreath is valuable, yes, but also symbolic. An attack not on the object, but on Lady Eugenia. Isidora looked away, jaw tightening. My mother has offended many people over the years. She is not the easiest person. Poirot noted her phrasing. Not mother. My mother. Distance. Tell me, madame, Poirot asked gently, did you know of the will revision? This time Isidora did not blink or flinch. She simply smiled. Of course I knew. Poirot arched a brow. Lady Eugenia informed you? No, she said lightly, but I know her well. My mother does nothing without considering how it will unsettle those around her. Poirot's eyes sharpened. You do not ask what is in the will. I do not need to. She has her favorites. She always has. Poirot paused. And on the morning of the theft? I was in the library, she said immediately. Reading. Alone. Poirot nodded slowly. A popular activity, it seems. Isidora smiled thinly. It is a large house, Monsieur Poirot. We do not spend our time hovering over one another. Indeed, Poirot murmured. And yet you were all together under one roof. Her expression flickered. For just a moment. I did not take the wreath, she said softly. Poirot smiled. I did not say you did. But the doubt already hung in the air. Julian strolled in with the casual swagger of a man who had long stopped caring about consequences. His coat was open, his tie loose, and his smirk ready. Ah, the famous Hercule Poirot, he drawled. My aunt always did have a flair for drama. Poirot gestured for him to sit. And you, monsieur, do you also enjoy the drama? I enjoy a good mystery, Julian said, crossing one leg over the other. It keeps the holidays interesting. Poirot examined him carefully. Tell me, monsieur, where were you yesterday morning? In the billiards room, Julian replied without hesitation. With whom? Myself. Poirot lifted one eyebrow. Alone? Again? Yes. This isn't a boarding school, Poirot. Adults occasionally spend time alone. Poirot smiled, but his gaze sharpened. Adults also often lie, monsieur, though not always well. Julian leaned forward. You think I stole the wreath? Poirot studied his relaxed posture, the restless glint in his eyes, the casual insolence. I think, Poirot said slowly, that you find the idea amusing. Julian's smirk widened. And I think you take holiday decorations far too seriously. Poirot ignored the jab. Your aunt, she recently changed her will. Julian's smile vanished instantly. What of it? You're not curious as to how her estate might be divided? Julian scoffed. I learned long ago not to expect generosity from Aunt Eugenia. Poirot caught it, the bitterness, sharp as vinegar. Merci, monsieur, Poirot said softly. Julian's smile returned, but it was thinner, more brittle, and he left without another word. Miss Dale entered with quiet dignity. Her dark dress, neat hair, and downcast eyes gave her an air of unfailing propriety. Poirot gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed. Miss Dale, he said warmly, you have been Lady Eugenia's companion and secretary for many years. 8 years, Monsieur Poirot. And you know her well? As well as anyone can know a woman as private as Lady Eugenia. Poirot nodded. You are aware of the will revision? Miss Dale inhaled sharply. No, she whispered, but I suspected something of the kind. You disapprove? Miss Dale looked down at her hands. It is not my place to approve or disapprove, but I fear what such changes can provoke in a family like this. Poirot felt a stir of sympathy. And on the morning of the theft? I was in Lady Eugenia's study, sorting correspondence. Alone? No, she said. Lady Eugenia was with me. Poirot paused. One alibi, finally. And did anything unusual occur? Miss Dale hesitated. For a moment, Lady Eugenia seemed distracted. She looked toward the window, as if sensing something was wrong. Poirot leaned forward. Wrong. Miss Dale nodded slowly. Yes, she said she felt watched. Poirot felt the room sharpen around him. Merci, mademoiselle, he said gently. You have been most helpful. As Miss Dale left, Poirot remained seated, tapping one fingertip lightly against the armrest. 4 interviews, 4 conflicting tones, 4 subtle inconsistencies, and 1 unmistakable truth. Someone in Highmoor Hall was lying, and Hercule Poirot intended to discover who. The afternoon settled over Highmoor Hall with a heavy stillness, as though the snowfall outside had muffled even the very air inside. Servants tiptoed through corridors, guests spoke in strained whispers, and Lady Eugenia maintained her icy composure, though Poirot noted the faint tremor in the way she adjusted her shawl. Such tremors always betrayed the truth. The mighty matriarch was worried. Poirot had retreated to the morning room, his sanctuary of order, where his notes were arranged with meticulous precision. He was reviewing them when Simmons appeared at the doorway. Monsieur Poirot, the butler said with a slight bow. The constabulary has arrived. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Ah, I had not summoned them. No, monsieur, Simmons replied delicately. Mr. Victor did. Poirot sighed softly, the heavy, resigned sound of a man accustomed to interference. Very well, he said, rising. Let us see what damage has already been done. Constable Harrow was a robust man with ruddy cheeks and a moustache that attempted, unsuccessfully, to compete with Poirot's. He carried an air of self-importance that often accompanies official authority in rural towns. Monsieur Poirot, he said with a severe nod, we've received a report of a theft. A rather festive item, I understand. Poirot kept his voice even. A theft, yes, but not festive, Constable. Symbolic. Harrow puffed out his chest. Well, I intend to handle this quickly. No need for foreign detective methods here. Poirot gave a faint smile. I look forward to observing your efficiency. Lady Eugenia stood by the fireplace, stoic as a statue. Victor hovered nearby, arms crossed tightly. Isadora and Julian lingered in opposite corners of the room. Miss Dale stood quietly behind Lady Eugenia, her hands folded neatly. Constable Harrow cleared his throat. I'll begin by asking, has anyone seen or heard anything suspicious? Julian's smirk sharpened. The suspicious thing is that we're all standing around discussing a wreath. Enough, Lady Eugenia said sharply. Constable, proceed. Harrow scanned the room. His gaze settled on a side door leading toward the back corridors. "And what is beyond that door?" he asked. "The servants' passage," Simmons replied. Harrow nodded decisively. "Right. Thieves often rely on less traveled routes. I'll begin my search there." Poirot lifted a hand. "Constable, if I might suggest—" But Harrow was already striding toward the door. Poirot sighed again. It took only minutes before the constable returned, flustered and triumphant. In his hand he held something, crushed pine needles bound with a thin strand of twine. Lady Eugenia inhaled sharply. "The wreath." "No, madame," Poirot said quietly. "Not the wreath, not even part of it." Harrow grinned broadly. "These were found in the servants' corridor, near the laundry room, freshly dropped, and I believe I know who dropped them." All eyes shifted to Emily Simmons, the butler's young daughter, who stood frozen near the doorway, pale and trembling, the same girl who had discovered the wreath missing. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Too easy. Too obvious. Harrow pointed an accusatory finger. You found the wreath missing, did you not? Because you were the one who removed it." Emily shook her head violently. "No, I only screamed when I saw—" "Where were you that morning?" Harrow demanded. "I was gathering linen, sir." "And you walked through the servants' corridor?" "Yes, sir." "And you expect us to believe," the constable said, growing louder, "that these pine needles just happened to fall at your feet?" Tears welled in the girl's eyes. "I didn't take anything, sir. I swear it." Simmons stepped forward, voice trembling with indignation. "Constable, my daughter is no thief." But Harrow was unmoved. Poirot finally intervened. "Constable, may I?" he asked gently. Harrow frowned. "If you must." Poirot approached Emily slowly, lowering himself to her eye level with great care. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "these pine needles, they were not dropped by you. They were placed." Harrow sputtered. "What nonsense!" Poirot raised a hand without looking at him. "When you entered the ballroom, Emily, did you notice anything unusual about the floor?" Emily sniffled. "There were pine needles everywhere, sir." Poirot nodded. "And did you step over them?" "Yes." Poirot turned to Harrow. "You see, Constable, the needles found near the laundry were subjected to pressure. They had been crushed underfoot repeatedly. But the needles on Emily's shoes," he gestured to the girl's boots, "are perfectly intact." Isadora frowned. "So someone wished to frame her?" Poirot gave a tiny shrug. "It is possible. Or perhaps someone wished to mislead the investigation. When an object such as the solstice wreath disappears, one must ask oneself, who benefits from a hasty conclusion?" Victor stiffened. "Are you suggesting one of us planted them?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I suggest nothing yet, monsieur, but I do observe." Harrow flushed crimson. "Well, if she didn't do it, then who did?" he blurted. Poirot glanced around the room, letting his eyes briefly touch each face. Victor's tight jaw, Isadora's cold stare, Julian's amused curiosity, Miss Dale's anxious posture, Lady Eugenia's impenetrable calm. "That," Poirot said quietly, "remains to be discovered." But the constable, unable to accept being outmaneuvered, persisted. "If the girl didn't do it," he grumbled, "then perhaps the servants as a whole should be questioned further." Lady Eugenia's voice cut through the room like a blade. "No, my staff are loyal. We will not cast suspicion upon them without due cause." Julian chuckled softly. "How touching, Aunt Eugenia. Loyalty from the staff, but not from us." Her glare silenced him. Poirot stepped forward. "Constable Harrow," he said kindly, "the matter of the wreath is more delicate than a simple theft. I advise caution. The wrong accusation, it could lead to ruin, for an innocent party." Harrow huffed. "Well then, Poirot, where would you have me look?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "Constable, you have already looked in the wrong place. because you are searching for the wrong thing." The room went still. Lady Eugenia leaned forward. "What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot paused, just long enough for tension to tighten the air. "You are all assuming that the wreath was taken," he said softly, "but you have not yet considered something far more unsettling." Julian smirked. "And what is that?" Poirot looked toward the empty hook above the ballroom fireplace. "That the person who stole it had no intention of keeping it." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor frowned deeply. "You think the wreath was stolen, only to be returned?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, monsieur. Returned or used." Lady Eugenia's hands gripped her armchair tightly. "Used? For what purpose?" Poirot did not answer immediately, because the truth, the tiny flicker of insight forming in his mind, was not yet ready to be spoken aloud. Instead, he said, "I believe we are dealing not with a common thief, but with someone who wishes to make a statement. The wreath is not gone, it is waiting, and when it reappears—" He let the sentence hang. "Everything will change." The constable stared at him, baffled. The family stared at him, unnerved. Poirot simply bowed his head. "The first false lead has now been disposed of," he said, "and the real mystery begins." The afternoon waned into a grey, restless evening. Snow had thickened over the lawns, and icy wind whispered against the window panes, filling Highmoor Hall with a tension that could be felt in the walls themselves. Dinner had been a strained affair, voices low, tempers higher, and glances exchanged like coded messages. Poirot, seated beside Lady Eugenia at the end of the long mahogany table, had watched with serene attentiveness. He ate little, spoke less, and observed every movement, every hesitation, every stiff smile. By the time the servants cleared dessert, he had formed an idea, not a conclusion, but a direction, a thread, thin but promising. After dinner, Lady Eugenia formally dismissed her guests to the drawing-room. A fire crackled in the hearth. The ornate room, draped in garlands and gold ribbons, seemed almost claustrophobic under the weight of unspoken suspicion. Poirot remained standing near the mantelpiece, hands tucked neatly behind his back. When all were assembled, he cleared his throat delicately. "My friends," he began, "I must trespass upon your patience once more." Victor groaned. Julian rolled his eyes. Isadora's teeth clenched almost imperceptibly. "As we continue this investigation," Poirot said calmly, "it becomes increasingly clear that the matter is not merely one of theft, but of intent. And so I must understand the emotional, the psychological landscape of this household." Julian laughed. "Here we go. Hercule Poirot's grand lecture." Poirot smiled. "But of course, it is essential, because one of you, one very specific person, understands the wreath not as an object, but as a symbol. A weapon." Lady Eugenia stiffened. "A weapon?" Poirot nodded. "Oui, madame. A weapon not of physical harm, but of emotional leverage." He turned first to Victor, whose posture was rigid as a drawn bow. Poirot addressed him gently. "Monsieur Victor, your mother's will has been revised. You have no idea what it contains, yet you are a man who appreciates predictability, control, stability." Victor's jaw tightened. "Is there a question in this?" Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Are you anxious, monsieur?" Victor looked away. "No," Poirot observed him. "Then why, during dinner, did you spend more time watching Lady Eugenia's movements than eating your meal? Why the stiffness, the glances toward the clock, the tapping of your fingers beneath the table?" Victor's face reddened. "You were watching me?" "Precisely," Poirot replied. Victor swallowed. "I simply want this matter resolved." "Do you?" Poirot asked softly. "Or are you afraid that when the wreath reappears, it will reveal something you would prefer remain hidden?" Victor inhaled sharply, then rose abruptly from his chair. "I won't be interrogated in front of everyone." You already have been, Poirot said quietly. Victor's face froze. Poirot stepped aside, allowing him to sit. He did, slowly, unwillingly. Poirot's gaze shifted to Isidora. Madame, you present yourself as calm, detached, yet you observe everything. Isidora met his gaze with icy precision. I am not a hysterical woman, Monsieur Poirot. No, Poirot said gently, but you are a resentful one. A soft ripple of shock moved through the room. Isidora's nostrils flared ever so slightly. I resent nothing. But your mother, Poirot said, revoked a long-standing agreement to endow the cultural society you adore. She refused your request for support. This, among other disagreements, has placed cracks in the facade of civility between you. Her lips thinned to a line. You think that would drive me to stealing a ridiculous wreath? No, Poirot replied, but perhaps it would drive you to symbolism. Isidora stood abruptly. This is absurd. Poirot merely bowed his head. As you wish, madame. Poirot turned to Julien next. Monsieur Julien, he said softly, you enjoy this. The chaos, the uncertainty. Julien spread his hands. How else should I pass the time? Highmoor Hall is not known for its entertainment. You hide behind humor, Poirot said. You are dismissive, mocking even. A man who has much to hide often chooses to laugh. Julien's smile wavered. Behind all jokes, Poirot continued, lies a truth. During dinner, when Lady Eugenia mentioned the wreath again, you looked, how shall I say, disconcerted. Julien shook his head. I was bored. Poirot leaned forward. Then why did your hand clutch the edge of your chair? Why the tension in your jaw? Why the sudden refusal of dessert, when earlier today you devoured pastries in the billiards room? Julien froze. The room watched him. After a moment that stretched thin as wire, Julien chuckled weakly. You have quite the imagination. Poirot smiled. And you, monsieur, have quite the fear. Julien looked away, jaw ticking. At last, Poirot turned to Miss Dale. Miss Dale, he said softly, you are the closest person to Lady Eugenia. You know her habits, her decisions, her vulnerabilities. Miss Dale's posture stiffened. And you have been loyal, Poirot continued. Painfully loyal. Perhaps too loyal. Miss Dale's voice quivered. I don't understand what you mean. Don't you? Poirot stepped closer. During dinner, you watched every exchange between the family with attention unmistakable, as if you feared a revelation, as if you feared the wreath might return at any moment and expose something. Miss Dale's eyes widened. I don't. Poirot raised a hand gently. Calm yourself, mademoiselle. I accuse no one, I observe. She lowered her gaze, swallowing hard. Poirot watched her another moment, noting the tremble in her fingers. Then he turned to the center of the room, the psychological trap fully set. You all sense it, Poirot said softly. That something more lies beneath this theft, something that binds each of you, something connected not to the wreath itself, but to Lady Eugenia. Lady Eugenia, who had been silent, finally spoke. Poirot, do you believe the wreath will reappear? Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Yes, madame, I do. When? She asked. Poirot tilted his head. When the thief wishes to escalate the message. The room's temperature seemed to drop, but Victor's brows knit. You think there will be another incident? Poirot looked at him steadily. I think, monsieur, that the wreath was only the beginning. Isidora's breath caught. Julien's smirk faded. Miss Dale's hands tightened. Lady Eugenia's expression hardened with resolve. Poirot let his gaze sweep the group one last time. You are all under stress, all uncertain, all fearful of what may come next, and in such a state, a person reveals more than they intend. He paused. Tonight, he said quietly, I will continue my observations. I advise each of you to remain calm, for soon enough, His eyes glinted. The thief will make their next move. As Poirot exited the drawing room, the family was left in a silence so thick it felt like fog. Behind him, the psychological game was already working. Subtle cracks had begun to appear, masks were slipping, motives sharpening, and somewhere inside Highmoor Hall, someone was preparing the next act. The storm that had been threatening all day finally settled over Highmoor Hall shortly after midnight. Snow thickened in heavy sheets across the windows, muffling the outside world into silence. Inside the estate, however, a quiet restlessness stirred. Shadows deepened along the corridors. Doors creaked faintly under the weight of cold. The old house seemed to hold its breath. Poirot did not retire immediately. Instead, he walked the upper corridor with slow, measured steps, pausing occasionally to observe the layout of rooms. Victor's at the far end, Julian's near the stairwell, Isadora's beside the small winter balcony, Miss Dale's adjoining Lady Eugenia's suite. The spacing, the sight lines, the proximity, all mattered. People commit crimes, yes, but houses help shape them. Only once Poirot had satisfied himself with the geography of Highmoor Hall did he return to his guest room. He did not sleep, however. He sat in an armchair, hands folded carefully, listening, because tonight he expected something. At precisely 1:47 a.m. it came. A scream, a single, piercing scream that shuddered through the quiet like a blade through silk. Poirot was already on his feet. The scream had come from the east corridor. Poirot half-jogged, his version of haste, and found Isadora standing just outside the winter balcony door, pale as the snow outside. "Madame," Poirot said, steadying her with a hand. "What has happened?" Isadora's voice shook. "Someone was outside my balcony, watching me." Poirot glanced at the frosted glass of the balcony door. A faint imprint, perhaps a hand, marred the thin layer of ice on the outside. "And what were you doing at this late hour, madame?" She swallowed. "I couldn't sleep." Poirot noted the tremor in her voice. Not quite fear, not quite guilt. Something else. Before he could ask another question, Simmons and several guests arrived, drawn by the scream. "What's happened?" Victor demanded. "Someone was on my balcony," Isadora cried, her composure cracking. Julian raised a brow. Who would be foolish enough to stand on a balcony in this weather? Poirot moved closer to the glass. The print was faint, smeared. Nothing clear enough to identify. But something else caught his attention, the balcony railing. Snow lay thick across its surface, yet in one section, directly before the door, it was disturbed, swept clean as though brushed away by a hurried hand. But there were no footprints in the snow on the balcony floor. Impossible, Poirot thought, unless... He filed the observation away. Lady Eugenia arrived moments later, wrapped in a heavy robe, hair pinned but slightly askew. "Isadora," she said sharply, "why did you scream the house awake?" Isadora pointed at the balcony door. "Someone was watching me." "You are certain?" Lady Eugenia's voice was severe. Isadora hesitated. I thought I saw a shadow, a figure, and the handprint..." Poirot interrupted softly. "There was indeed someone near your balcony door, madame. But whether they intended to frighten you, that remains unclear." Victor stepped forward. "This is madness. First the wreath, now someone lurking about at night? Among us?" Poirot tilted his head. "Not among you, monsieur." Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot didn't answer. He was studying something. Something small, nearly invisible, caught in the groove between the balcony door and the frame. A single thread, thin, green, fibrous. He plucked it delicately. A fragment of evergreen leaf. Not from any wreath displayed in the hall. This one was older. Poirot's eyes glinted. "A development," he murmured. but he put the fragment deep into his pocket. Not for the constable, not for Lady Eugenia, but for himself alone. With Isidora escorted back into her room under Simmons' watch, Poirot made his way downstairs to clear his thoughts. As he passed through the central corridor, something caught his attention, a faint glow coming from the ballroom. Impossible. The ballroom had been locked earlier. Poirot approached cautiously. The door was ajar, of just a fraction, enough to let out a sliver of warm orange light. He pushed it open silently and froze. The chandelier glowed softly above, casting golden light over the room. In the center of the parquet floor lay something new, something delicate, arranged with deliberate intent. A small circle of pine needles, perfectly formed. A ring, a wreath shape, and at its center, Poirot's breath caught the missing solstice wreath. But it was not intact. It lay crumpled, torn, violated. A section of holly berries crushed beneath deliberate pressure. Several herbs snapped, the binding twine half severed. Yet the wreath had been placed with ritualistic symmetry, the circle perfect despite the destruction. Poirot stepped closer, heart beating fast, not with fear, but with the thrill of revelation. Someone had returned it, but someone had also changed it. This was no random act. This was a message clearer than speech. Footsteps approached behind him. Julian's voice echoed across the ballroom. "My God!" Poirot turned as Julian stepped inside, eyes wide, shock etched across his features. "You found it," Julian whispered. "But what happened to it?" Poirot gestured for him to stay back. "Do not touch anything, monsieur." Julian stepped closer anyway, hands slightly raised. Who would do this?" Poirot studied his face. Genuine shock, or well-practiced surprise. "It is not who would do this," Poirot said softly. "It is who needed to." Julian swallowed. Before either man could speak further, others rushed in. Victor first, then Isidora, despite instructions, Miss Dale, and finally Lady Eugenia. Lady Eugenia stopped dead. Her breath hitched, not loudly, not dramatically, but faintly, like a crack forming within granite. "My wreath," she whispered. Poirot turned toward her. "It has returned, madame." "Returned?" Victor spat. "It's been destroyed." Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, monsieur. Not destroyed. Altered. Transformed for a purpose." Lady Eugenia's eyes remained fixed on the wreath, her expression unreadable, but her fingers curling into tight fists. "Why," she whispered, "would anyone do this?" Poirot stepped into the center of the room, just past the circle of needles. "Because," he said softly, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom, "the theft was not the crime." They all stared at him. Poirot lifted his hand slightly. This display, this staging, this is the crime." Miss Dale gasped. Isidora shivered. Victor clenched his jaw. Julian frowned deeply. Lady Eugenia stood as still as a carved figure. Poirot continued. "Someone in this house wished to deliver a message. The first act was the disappearance. The second act," he gestured to the wreath, lying like a fallen crown, "is the desecration." "And the message," Lady Eugenia whispered. Poirot looked at her, eyes burning with understanding. "The message is for you, madame, and only you." Another silence fell. He stepped back from the wreath. "And now," Poirot said softly, "the time has come. The lines are drawn. The game has changed." He turned toward the family. "And the real motive begins to reveal itself." The desecrated wreath remained on the ballroom floor like a corpse laid out for inspection. The guests had been ushered away, some reluctantly, some gratefully, until only Poirot, Lady Eugenia, and the faint glow of the chandelier lingered in the vast room. Poirot stood with hands clasped behind him, rocking slightly on his heels, his eyes flicking, quick, precise, from the wreath to the pine needle circle to the empty hook above the hearth. He walked the perimeter of the display as though tracing the shape of a crime drawn on invisible parchment. Lady Eugenia broke the silence first. "Poirot," she said softly, "what does it mean?" Poirot stopped, turned, and bowed his head just enough to show respect without conceding ground. "Madame, it means more than you think, and less than you fear." "Cryptic nonsense," she snapped. "Wisdom, madame," Poirot said gently, "or perhaps merely patience." Lady Eugenia inhaled sharply, then steeled herself. "Tell me plainly, am I in danger?" Poirot studied her face. Strength, age, pride, grief. But beneath all that, something else. Something he had suspected from the first moment she mentioned the revised will. He answered carefully. "I believe, madame, that you are not the target of physical harm, but emotional harm, psychological. Ah, that is another story." Lady Eugenia's chin lifted. "I am not easily shaken." Poirot's eyes drifted to the wreath on the floor. "That," he murmured, "is what someone wishes to test." She opened her mouth to respond, but Poirot raised a hand. "Forgive me, Lady Crawford. There are things I must think over in solitude. The wreath, it has spoken." He tapped his temple. "Now the little grey cells must listen." She stared at him, bewildered and unsettled. Poirot stepped forward, offering a bow of impeccable courtesy. "Good night, madame." And he left her standing in the ballroom, the wreath's broken circle glowing faintly at her feet like a warning cast in amber light. Poirot did not retire to his room yet. Instead, he moved through the darkened halls, his footsteps soft on the runner carpets. The house was different at night, larger somehow, its corners deeper, its shadows thicker. He passed the drawing room and paused. Inside, Julian sat alone, the amber glow of a lamp outlining his silhouette. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand, untouched. Poirot watched him through the gap in the door. Julian was not drinking. Julian was thinking. Not grief, not fear, something else. Poirot nodded to himself and moved on. Down the east corridor, Isadora's door was cracked open, faint lamplight seeping into the hallway. She sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection, fingers tapping anxiously against the tabletop. "Madame Isadora is unraveling," Poirot whispered to himself. He filed the observation away. Farther down, near the staircase, Victor stood at a window, shoulders hunched. Poirot recognized the postures immediately. Victor Crawford was calculating, scheming, mapping consequences. "Ambition," Poirot murmured. "And fear." He continued on. At last, as he approached the west wing, he saw Miss Dale slip quietly into Lady Eugenia's study. Her face was tight, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. Poirot lingered at a distance, unseen. "Guilt," he whispered, "or loyalty twisted into something more fierce." He added this, too, to the growing tapestry inside his mind. Then he returned to the ballroom, because that was where the hidden clue lay. The room was silent now, silent enough that Poirot could hear the faint crackling of cooling embers in the hearth. He knelt beside the wreath and touched nothing at first. He simply looked. Anyone else would see chaos. Snapped dried herbs, broken berries, crushed pine, severed twine. But Poirot saw structure, pattern, a deliberate destruction with a very particular message. He bent closer. Then, using a handkerchief, he lifted a fragment of holly branch. Beneath it, half hidden by needles, something glinted faintly under the chandelier's light. Poirot froze. He leaned in. There, embedded between the broken twine fibers, was a sliver of metal, no larger than the clipped edge of a matchstick. Poirot delicately angled it into the light. Not metal, a staple, but not from the wreath. A modern staple, from a paper packet, a small packet, narrow, folded. Poirot's eyes sharpened. He reached farther beneath the wreath, between the overlapping layers of preserved foliage. And there, caught among the inner coils, not visible unless one knew exactly where to look, was a scrap of paper, faintly torn, bent, crumpled by pressure. He did not remove it, not yet. He used his handkerchief again to protect the fragment, sliding it slightly, upward until he could read a single word. Just one, but enough. It said, December. Poirot's pulse quickened. Not revelation, not triumph. Recognition. He knew what this paper had been part of. He knew where it came from. He knew who had torn it. And above all, he knew why the wreath had not merely been stolen, but dismantled. Poirot sat back on his heels, closing his eyes. The piece of the puzzle was small, minute even, but it was the key that unlocked the direction of the crime. He finally understood something. The thief was not obsessed with the wreath. The thief was obsessed with what had been hidden in the wreath. A secret, a message, a warning, or perhaps a truth Lady Eugenia had concealed. Poirot opened his eyes, slow and controlled. He stood. He took the scrap of paper and staple, wrapped them in the handkerchief, and slipped them into his pocket. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom with the quiet satisfaction of a man who now possessed something no one else did. A clue. A real clue. A hidden clue. And tomorrow, when he questioned the suspects again, he would put this clue to use. Not openly, not directly, but subtly, psychologically. Because now, Poirot knew which thread to pull, and when he pulled it, the whole web would shake. The next morning dawned pale and cold, the snow outside piled high against the window panes like nature's barricade. Highmoor Hall, wrapped in its white cocoon, felt isolated, cut off from the world, suspended in a silence as thick as velvet. But inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. Lady Eugenia sat at the head of the drawing-room table, her expression carved from stone. Victor stood near the mantelpiece, hands clasped behind his back. Isadora sat rigidly on the settee, fingers intertwined too tightly. Julian lounged by the window, but his posture was stiff, his eyes shadowed. Miss Dale hovered close to Lady Eugenia, pale and restless. Poirot entered the room with a calmness that only made everyone more uneasy. "Mes amis," he said, "I thank you for assembling so early. We have much to discuss." Victor's voice was clipped. "Poirot, we are tired of riddles. If you have something to say it plainly." Poirot smiled faintly. "Oh, but I will not speak plainly until the moment is right. Precision, monsieur, is the essence of detection, and premature revelations spoil a mystery and a motive." Julian scoffed under his breath. "Here we go." Poirot turned sharply. "Indeed, Monsieur Julian, here we go." Poirot walked the length of the drawing-room slowly, deliberately. His eyes took in the furniture, the guests, the fireplace, the wreath hook above the mantel. A stage upon which a family drama had been unfolding long before he arrived. He stopped at the center of the room. "I've asked you all here," Poirot began, "because last night changed the nature of the crime." Julian blinked. "The wreath?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, but not merely its return, its condition. It was not simply torn or abused. It was opened." Confusion rippled through the room. Poirot continued, "And inside the wreath, hidden among the preserved leaves and herbs, I found something unexpected. Not a decoration, not a keepsake." Lady Eugenia's spine straightened. "A piece of paper." Miss Dale gasped softly. Victor shifted his weight. Isadora leaned forward. Julian's jaw clenched. Poirot noted every reaction. "And what was on this paper?" Victor demanded. Poirot held up a finger. Patience, monsieur. I will tell you soon. He began pacing again. But before that, I must ask each of you a question, one simple question, whose answer may clarify matters enormously. He turned to Victor first. Victor Crawford, Poirot said, what did you do yesterday afternoon between 4 and 30? Victor blinked, taken aback. I was in my room. And did anyone see you? No. Poirot nodded, unsurprised. And what were you doing? Victor hesitated. Going over some correspondence. Poirot smiled gently. Correspondence you burned afterward. Victor stiffened. How did you? Poirot held up a hand. Your fireplace grate showed fresh soot this morning, and you are not a man who reads novels. Julian snorted. Touché. Poirot moved on. To Isidora. Madame Isidora, he said, turning toward her. Last night you believed someone was watching you from the balcony. Why? Isidora swallowed. I sensed movement. A shadow. Poirot tilted his head. Strange, because there were no footprints on your balcony. Isidora blinked. What? Poirot smiled softly. Precisely. Fresh snow, untouched. Yet the railing had been swept clean by a hand. He leaned closer. Someone wanted you to think you were being watched. Isidora pressed a trembling hand to her throat. But who would do that? Poirot did not answer. Not yet. To Julian, Poirot turned. Monsieur Julian, you were the first to find me in the ballroom last night. Why were you awake? Julian shrugged, though his shoulders were too stiff. I couldn't sleep. No? Poirot asked. Yet earlier yesterday, you bragged about your ability to sleep through even a hurricane. Julian's mouth tightened. Poirot continued, voice a shade softer. And there was whiskey in your glass. But none missing from the bottle you claimed to pour from. Julian frowned. So, Poirot said, you were pretending to drink, pretending to be relaxed, pretending not to be afraid. Julian's eyes flashed. Poirot turned last to Miss Dale. Mademoiselle, he said gently, you were in Lady Eugenia's study last night. Why? Miss Dale froze. I was checking correspondence, as I always do. Poirot approached slowly, like a man walking toward a cornered truth. And yet, he murmured, you were not sorting papers. You were looking for one. Miss Dale's throat tightened. Lady Eugenia turned to her sharply. Margaret, is this true? Miss Dale's breath trembled. Poirot spoke gently but firmly. You were searching for a document Lady Eugenia hid. A document recently removed from her possession and placed, very cleverly, within the solstice wreath. A gasp filled the room. Lady Eugenia's hand flew to her mouth. Poirot continued. And last night, the wreath was opened, the message revealed, and someone panicked. Julian, pale now, whispered, What message, Poirot? Poirot exhaled. A will. Silence fell like a physical blow. Poirot looked around at the stunned faces. Yes, he said softly. A fragment of Lady Eugenia's revised will was hidden in the wreath, and someone tore it from its place, carelessly, desperately, and left behind a scrap. Lady Eugenia's face was ashen. Who? She whispered. Who would do such a thing? Poirot did not answer. Not yet. Instead, he moved back to the center of the room. The will revision, he said slowly, has placed many of you in states of uncertainty. Fear, resentment. It is the spark behind every action committed here in the last 48 hours. He turned to Victor. You feared losing control. To Isidora. You feared losing inheritance long denied. To Julian. You feared consequences of debts and disgrace. To Miss Dale. You feared losing your place, your purpose. Perhaps more. He paused. Then he lifted one finger. And someone among you feared all of these things at once. A charged silence fell. Victor spoke first, voice cracking. Poirot, tell us plainly. Who did it? Poirot's eyebrows lifted. All in good time, monsieur. Before the truth can be revealed, I must confirm one final piece. A detail so small, so subtle, that it escaped even the sharpest eyes. Except mine. He tapped his temple. Tonight I will gather you again, in the ballroom, with the wreath. Lady Eugenia stiffened. And then? She whispered. Poirot smiled gently. And then, madame, the murderer will reveal himself. Gasps erupted. Murderer! Isidora cried. Victor blanched. Julian stumbled back a step. Poirot raised a hand. Yes, he said quietly. For the crime committed at Highmoor Hall is not merely the desecration of a wreath. His eyes gleamed. It is something far darker. He bowed slightly. And tonight I shall prove it. Evening fell with a heavy quiet over Highmoor Hall, the snow outside now a thick wall of white pressing against the windows. The ballroom, lit once again by the chandelier's golden glow, felt transformed, not festive, not celebratory, but solemn, almost ceremonial. The damaged wreath rested on a velvet cloth atop a long wooden table, its crushed holly and torn herbs stark under the lights. Poirot stood at the center of the room, immaculate as ever, hands folded neatly behind his back. He had the air of a priest about to begin a ritual. Simmons ushered the family in one by one. Victor, Isidora, Julian, Miss Dale. Lady Eugenia, supported by her cane, composed yet trembling. Once they were arranged in a semicircle before him, Poirot began. "My friends," he said softly, "we have reached the moment when truth must step forward and lies must fall away." Victor exhaled sharply. "Poirot, enough theater." Poirot lifted a single finger. "Monsieur, do not interrupt me. Not now." Victor stiffened. Poirot continued. The theft of the solstice wreath, the desecration of it, the panic that followed, each of these acts was calculated, designed, crafted with purpose. He stepped closer to the wreath's remains. But that purpose was not celebration, nor mischief, nor even greed. He turned. It was fear. Isidora swallowed. Miss Dale's lips parted. Julian shifted uneasily. Lady Eugenia stared straight ahead, refusing to betray emotion. Poirot began to pace. When I arrived, the wreath had been stolen without force, taken by someone with access, someone who knew the locks, the routines, the layout of the house, someone who knew Lady Eugenia's traditions intimately. He paused. But the true clue lay not in the taking, but in the returning. Julian muttered, "Here we go." Poirot ignored him. The wreath was not simply returned, it was opened, broken apart, as if the thief searched for something hidden inside. Lady Eugenia's hand trembled on her cane. And indeed, Poirot continued, something was inside. Victor frowned. What, exactly? Poirot tapped his breast pocket. A fragment of a document, torn, crumpled, bearing the words December and part of a legal clause. This fragment, mes amis, comes from Lady Eugenia's revised will. Gasps, a hand over a mouth, a stifled cry. Poirot pressed on. Lady Eugenia hid her revised will inside the wreath, a symbolic vault for a symbolic act. Only she knew of its location. Lady Eugenia closed her eyes for a brief moment. Only Poirot noticed. But the will was disturbed, tampered with, torn apart. Poirot's voice hardened, and someone attempted to retrieve it. Victor turned crimson. "Are you accusing me, Poirot?" Poirot smiled gently. "I accuse no one, yet. But you, monsieur, have already admitted to burning documents yesterday afternoon." Victor flinched. Before he could respond, Poirot stepped toward Isidora. "Madame Isidora, someone swept snow from your balcony railing without leaving footprints. A trick, a staged delusion to make you scream." "Why?" Isidora shook her head wildly. I don't know." Poirot's eyes gleamed. Because a scream distracts. A scream draws attention away from a second location. A scream gives the thief time. Julian stiffened. Poirot turned on him. And you, Monsieur Julian, you claim you could not sleep, yet the whiskey in your glass was untouched. A prop, a performance. Why? Julian swallowed. Poirot leaned closer. Because you were awake. Awake and moving, awake and afraid. Julian looked away. Poirot pivoted to Miss Dale. Mademoiselle Dale, you were in Lady Eugenia's study, searching, desperate. Why? Miss Dale's breath hitched. I was looking for something she hid. What something? Poirot pressed. Miss Dale shook her head, trembling. I can't say. Poirot tilted his head. You mean you will not? Lady Eugenia finally spoke, her voice low. Margaret, what were you looking for? Miss Dale clasped her hands tightly. I was afraid, she whispered. Poirot nodded. Yes, fear is the root of everything here, and fear drives people to desperate acts. Poirot stepped back to the center. Lady Eugenia, your revised will. Whom did it exclude? Whom did it reward? Whom did it punish? These are questions someone in this room could not bear to have answered. Lady Eugenia did not answer. Her eyes closed. Poirot continued. The desecration of the wreath was not rage. It was searching for a hidden truth. He raised his voice slightly. But last night, something new happened, something far more telling. He faced them all. The person who searched the wreath knew exactly where to find the hidden document. That knowledge eliminates 3 of you immediately. Gasps erupted. Faces drained of color. Poirot lifted a single finger. But before I reveal whom it eliminates and whom it leaves, I must explain the final clue. He turned toward the wreath. This wreath is nearly 2 centuries old. Its herbs were preserved using a traditional resin, binding them tightly. To break it open without damaging everything inside requires knowledge, expertise, a delicate understanding of old materials. He paused. And the torn twine was cut, not by hands, but by a letter opener from a specific set, a set belonging to... His eyes darted across the room, pausing deliberately on each suspect. One person alone. The room went still. Poirot lowered his voice to a haunting whisper. The thief of the wreath is the same person who feared the contents of the revised will. The same person who staged the balcony incident. The same person who planted pine needles in the servants' corridor. His eyes glinted, and the same person who was willing to go even further. Lady Eugenia's voice trembled. Poirot, what do you mean? Poirot took a long breath. Madame, the desecration of the wreath was not the second crime. He turned slowly. It was the warning before the second crime. Silence. You mentioned a murderer, Poirot, Victor said quietly. What murder? Poirot looked at him with solemn gravity. The murder that was attempted here at Highmoor Hall. A collective cry broke out. Julian swore. Isadora staggered back. Victor shouted. Miss Dale gasped. Lady Eugenia clutched her cane. Poirot raised a hand. Yes, an attempted murder. One carefully disguised as a threat, and one directed at a single person. Lady Eugenia whispered, At me. Poirot stepped forward. Yes, madame. Another ripple of shock. Poirot continued, And tonight, I shall reveal who attempted it. He bowed slightly. This, he declared, is the end of the mystery's shadow. He lifted his gaze, sharp as a blade. And in the next moment we shall step into the light. The ballroom had never felt colder. The damaged solstice wreath lay at the center of the room, broken, unraveling, the symbol of an old legacy torn apart. The chandelier glowed above it like an unforgiving spotlight. Snow beat against the tall windows in slow, heavy rhythms. Poirot stood before the table, his small frame somehow filling the entire room with authority. Victor, Isadora, Julian, Miss Dale, Lady Eugenia. All faced him, all pale, all waiting. Poirot clasped his hands gently. "Mes amis," he began, "the moment has come. Every action that occurred within these walls, every lie, every panic, every cry for help, has led to this." He turned toward the wreath. The first crime was not the theft, it was the reason for the theft. Lady Eugenia swallowed hard. "You mean my will?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, madame. Your revised will was a weapon, and someone knew it." He faced the group. Whoever stole the wreath was not after the object, but the contents hidden inside it. Poirot lifted 2 fingers. "First, let us dismiss those who could not possibly have known the will's hiding place." His gaze moved to Victor. "You, monsieur, had motive, perhaps the strongest of all, but no knowledge of the wreath's secret. You burned documents yesterday, yes? But those were your documents. Letters relating to loans and political correspondence. You feared the future, not the present." Victor stiffened, but relief softened his eyes. Poirot turned to Isidora next. "Madame, you have long felt overshadowed by your mother, but last night's balcony incident, engineered to frighten you, was staged by someone who wanted to create chaos, not someone paralyzed by fear of the will." Isidora exhaled shakily. Poirot nodded. "And so, it was not you." He turned next to Julian. "Monsieur Julian, you hide behind charm and insolence. You are a man drowning in debts, yes, but you are also a man who enjoys risk. Yet last night your fear was genuine. You pretended to drink whiskey to steady your nerves, but you could not bring yourself to swallow a drop." Julian's eyes darted away. Poirot's voice softened. "You feared being suspected, monsieur, not being disinherited. You did not know about the will." Julian let out a breath of visible relief. That left 2. Lady Eugenia and Miss Dale. Both stood utterly still. Poirot stepped closer to Miss Dale. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you have been at Lady Eugenia's side for 8 years. You manage her correspondence, her archives, her appointments. You know her handwriting, her habits." Miss Dale's voice quivered. "I have been loyal, always loyal." Poirot nodded sadly. "Yes, perhaps loyal to a fault." He reached into his pocket. "And the clue that revealed you, mademoiselle, was not the scrap of the will." Miss Dale's breath hitched. "It was this." He held up the tiny sliver of metal, the staple. "For decades, Lady Eugenia used wax seals on her private documents. Traditional, elegant, old-fashioned. But you, Miss Dale, you prefer staples. Efficient, modern, discreet." Miss Dale swayed slightly as if struck. Poirot's voice sharpened. "And you, who handled the will before it was hidden, would never have left a staple embedded within the wreath unless—" Miss Dale whispered, "unless I searched for it." Poirot nodded. "Yes." A hush fell. Lady Eugenia stared at her secretary. "Margaret, why?" Miss Dale's eyes filled. "Because you were going to dismiss me." Her voice cracked. "After 8 years, you were going to cast me aside." Lady Eugenia's face tightened. "I made no such decision." Miss Dale shook her head desperately. "You changed your will. I saw you drafting it. I saw the notes. You were leaving me with nothing, not even the cottage you once promised." Poirot stepped forward. "So you searched for the will. You stole the wreath. You tore it apart, desperate to find the document." Miss Dale shook her head violently. "No, I didn't mean harm. I only wanted to see it. I only wanted to know." Poirot's voice sharpened like a blade. "And when Lady Eugenia confronted you last night in the corridor, demanding to know if you had seen anything suspicious," Lady Eugenia gasped. You followed me. You were behind me." Miss Dale clasped her hands. "I woke and saw your door open. I thought you knew. I panicked." Poirot nodded. "And in your panic, mademoiselle, you pushed her." A horrified silence crashed over the room. Miss Dale's face drained of all color. I barely touched her. It was instinct. I didn't mean... She stumbled. Lady Eugenia lifted her hand to her chest, shock slowly settling. I slipped on the polished floor and grabbed the railing. Poirot finished gently. It was an attempt, mademoiselle. Not a successful murder, but it was enough. Miss Dale collapsed into a chair, sobs shaking her. I loved this house. I loved my life here. And when I thought she was taking it away... Poirot's voice softened. Fear, mademoiselle, is the greatest enemy of reason. Miss Dale wiped her eyes. You don't understand. I knew she was changing her will. I saw her meeting with the solicitor. I saw the drafts. She was cutting me out. Everything was slipping away. Poirot nodded. And so you staged chaos. You planted pine needles in the servants' corridor to mislead suspicion. You frightened Isadora to create distraction. You watched Julian, Victor, and Isadora turn on one another. He gestured to the wreath. You thought the will was nestled there, and indeed part of it was. But you only found a fragment. Miss Dale choked out. I didn't want anyone hurt. I only wanted to know my fate. Poirot's gaze softened with quiet pity. And that, mademoiselle, is why the great tragedies of life often begin with small, fearful lies. Constable Harrow, summoned by Simmons during the confrontation, entered the ballroom, hat in hand. Poirot stepped aside. She will not resist, he said quietly. Miss Dale rose slowly, eyes hollow. Lady Eugenia turned away, her face hidden in shadow. I never meant to harm you, Miss Dale whispered. Lady Eugenia's reply was cold, brittle. You harmed yourself. Harrow escorted Miss Dale from the room. Her sobs echoed faintly down the corridor. The family stood in stunned silence. Victor broke it first. Poirot, what will become of her? Poirot sighed. That, monsieur, lies in the hands of the law, but perhaps the court will show mercy. Her crime was born of fear, not malice. Isadora whispered. And the will? Lady Eugenia closed her eyes. I will complete it properly this time, without secrets. Julian let out a shaky breath. So this holiday wasn't cursed after all. Poirot smiled softly. Non, monsieur. It was simply human. Later, as dawn crept over the snowy horizon, Poirot prepared to depart. Simmons brought his coat, brushing the collar clean with respectful care. Lady Eugenia approached him slowly. Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly, you have done more than uncover the truth. You have reminded me that secrets, once hidden, rot everything around them. Poirot inclined his head. Madame, secrets are like wreaths, beautiful when whole, destructive when broken. She nodded. You have my gratitude. Poirot smiled warmly. And now, madame, I take my leave. A peaceful Christmas to you. She exhaled. And to you, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot stepped into the fresh, crisp snow outside as sunlight broke across the estate. He paused, looking back once at Highmoor Hall. Then, with a small smile and a soft touch to his impeccable moustache, he whispered, Ah, the human heart, always the most complicated mystery of all. And he walked onward, leaving behind the hall, the wreath, the secrets, and another solved enigma for the world's most meticulous detective.